In 2020, God told me that I was going to go through a battle because I didn't trust him and I didn't think that he was good. And I remember sitting in my room where I had been praying, and I was completely shocked because it was true. When I was 19 years old, I lost my brother to an overdose, and I've never been the same afterwards. And I didn't think that God was good because he hurt me and he hurt my family. And I didn't trust him not to hurt more people that I loved. And so for years after my brother passed away, I dealt with bad anxiety and a constant fear of death and losing people that I loved and even losing my own life. And shortly after God told me this, I found out that a cyst that I had been living with was actually cancer. I had gotten it removed and they tested it and found out that it was a rare cancer called Grade Fibromyxoid Sarcoma. And it's rare and slow growing. And because of the misdiagnosis, I had been living with it for like over 5 years. And there were a few weeks from when I found out that I had the cancer to when my scheduled PET scan was, which is a full body scan that searches for more cancer. And the cancer that I had often goes to the lungs. And I remembered what God had said about me going through the battle, so I assumed that the battle would be me having cancer and dealing with this. And I was preparing myself for the absolute worst. At the time, I was a young mom of a 2-year-old, and every day, I was just flooded with thoughts of the worst outcome. I was crying constantly, and I was walking around pretty much defeated. And one day I was on a walk with my mom and my sister, and I remember I was talking to them, and I was asking them for reassurance that if anything would ever happen to me, they would take care of my son, and help my husband. And I'll never forget my mom's face. And she cut me off and she said, "I'm not going to accept that. I'm not going to accept that." And I remember I was mad and I was hurt. And I remember telling her, "You know that God doesn't always heal us here on this earth." And she looked at me very sternly and she said, "I know that God doesn't always heal us, but my prayer will always be for healing." And in that moment, I was so convicted because my mom, she lost her son, my brother. And after everything she had been through, if she could still have such faith in God and such hope and such trust for him to take care of us, then surely I could too. So I started to pray differently. Instead of praying for peace to accept my circumstances, and instead of praying for my family to be okay if something happened to me, I started praying for faith and to believe that God could heal me. And at the time I was studying Joshua and reading about the walls of Jericho, which is, a book that I had read many times and something that I had heard many times in church. But at this point in my life, it spoke to me very differently. And one of my favorite scriptures in this book is Joshua 2, 9 through 11. It says, "I know the Lord has given you this land," she told them. "We are all afraid of you. Everyone in this land is living in terror, for we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 Amorite kings east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below." So God had been working behind the scenes, preparing the way for the victory. And obviously he already knew that the people of Israel were going to have the victory. And because they had been obedient in smaller circumstances, not even knowing that everybody else around them was watching God move and God perform miracles and God win battles for them. And the people inside the walls in Jericho, you would think they'd have the advantage. They had these impenetrable walls. I'm sure they had their own big army. But they were trembling in fear because they knew that God had already given over their land. And all God asked these people to do, the Israelites, was to, march and to blow horns and to shout when he said shout. And they did. And then the walls came down. Not because of their strength, but because of God. And I knew that God was asking me if I would trust him, in the same way, to be strong and courageous, to lay aside my fear and my doubt, to put aside my knowledge as a nurse, and to trust him even when things didn't look good, when the report didn't say what I wanted it to say, when I knew what could happen, and I did. I decided to trust God. And so I went in for the PET scan, and if I'm honest, I cried the whole entire time. I was sobbing like a baby. But I was praying, and I was asking God for faith. And the results came back, and the cancer had not spread anywhere else in my body in over 5 years. And my lungs were good, my lungs were clear. There were still some cancer cells in the area where they took out the tumor, and we had planned to go back in at a later date to remove those cancer cells to get clear margins. And when I had the scan to check before the predicted surgery, those margins were clear, those cancer cells were completely gone. So God had healed me. And I really believe that God used the cancer to get a hold of me. Not that he gave me cancer, but he allowed the situation and the circumstance and me dealing with cancer to be used to repair our relationship. And because for years I had been keeping him at arm's length because I was hurt. And, I'd go to church, I'd follow the Bible, I'd tithe, I could tell you, what God said, I'd read the Bible, but I didn't want to feel any emotions. And the whole time I knew God was saying, let me heal you. Let me heal you of your grief. But, I was too scared of the pain, and I was too scared to let God into those deep and dark areas of my heart where there was so much bitterness and anger. There was a lot of anger. And I felt so ashamed of it. But it was real pain, and it was how I felt. But he already knew all of this, and he wasn't fooled by me going through the emotions at all. And he was the one that called me out and said, I know you don't trust me, and I know you don't think I'm good, and let's fix this. Let's fix this. He knew that I was mad at him, and I felt ashamed, but he loved me so much to pursue me. And cancer was just only part of the battle. The real battle was in my thoughts and in my beliefs in my head. And God had put me in a situation where I was surrounded by some of my worst fears. I was looking at the possibility of dying if things were really bad. And I had to choose whether I would continue to hold on to fear and death, or I would let that go and choose to trust God in this situation. And I chose to trust him. And maybe you've gone through something similar, like the loss of a loved one, or are facing a devastating illness, and you're struggling to see God's goodness. And I'm here to tell you that God knows. Jesus not only died for our sins, but he died for our sorrows. And one of my very favorite scriptures is Isaiah 53:4. It says, yet it was our weaknesses he carried. It was our sorrows that weighed him down. He died not only so that we can be forgiven of our sins and live in freedom from sin, but also for our sorrows, so that we can live in freedom from such sorrow, and we don't have to walk around wounded and hurt and devastated and hopeless. And I don't know, why people have to experience such traumatic and painful things in life, but I know it's not because God isn't good, and I know it's not because he isn't trustworthy, and I know it's definitely not because he does not love us. When I tried to, deal with my own grief, I was an anxious mess. And when I tried to deal with my own cancer, I was hopeless, walking around hopeless. And when I prayed and chose to trust God, despite how I felt, and despite how my circumstances looked, I was healed. And I believe that God can do the same for you. We were never created to walk around wounded and defeated. And yes, when you lose somebody that you love, you grieve. And God understands that. We're human. We have emotions. That's how he created us. And when we get a bad diagnosis, we grieve. And he understands that. And when life doesn't turn out how we planned and we're hurt, we grieve. And he understands that. But we are not meant to stay in a place of hopelessness and devastation. We're not meant to cling to hopelessness and devastation and sorrow and fear instead of God. We are meant to cling to God in these situations. I miss my brother every single day, and I still have bad days and I still cry. And because I love him, obviously, and because I miss him, and God knows that, and he would never forsake me for that. He gave me my brother for a reason. but I'm definitely no longer hopeless. You know, I have such hope for the future and such goodness, and I see God's hand in everything, even in my brother's death, and even in the lives that my brother touched, and even in the testimony that my mother and I have of losing my brother, of how many lives it touches and hope it gives to other people who are struggling with similar things. And that is the goodness of God. And if you need prayer, you can leave a comment below and I will pray for you. You can reach out to me and I will pray for you. And if you've gone through something similar and would like to share your story, I would love to hear it. Thank you.